Hey there, I'm Jackie Ferris. You may have heard of the Underground Railroad. Well, it was neither underground or a railroad. Instead, it was a series of clandestine routes and safe houses used by enslaved African Americans to escape to freedom. This week on the 302, we are in historic Odessa, checking out an exhibit called Freedom Seekers that documents Delaware's role in the Underground Railroad. Get ready to follow the trail. The 302 is headed your way. Welcome to historic Odessa, where we're going to be talking about an exhibit that you can come and check out that deals with the Underground Railroad on a national scale in Delaware and right here in Odessa. I'm joined by Johnny Baker, who's going to tell us all about it. Johnny, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for visiting us.
Now, for someone who may not be familiar with the Underground Railroad, it was neither underground or a railroad. Tell us what it was.
No, although that's what an awful lot of people who come here think. It was just a code word, actually, that was used by fugitive slaves to get from wherever they were enslaved to freedom. It was secret, thus the word underground, and they tried not to leave any trace of themselves. They tried not to implicate anyone who assisted them, but it was a way to work yourself to freedom. It was a secret passage.
Now, this is pretty prolific. About 100,000 African American slaves found their way to Mexico, to Canada, to the northern states where they were able to live in freedom. But you mentioned it was all in code, and I want to talk a little bit about it because it really is fascinating the way that they would communicate with each other. For instance, you know, someone who would take someone seeking their freedom on their journey would be a conductor. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the other lingo that was used at the time?
Sure. Safe houses where slaves knew that during the day, which was really the most dangerous time to travel, they knew that in certain safe houses they could be hidden, whether it was in a cubbyhole somewhere, whether it was in a basement, whether it was in a secret room. They could be hidden there, they would be safe, and then they would be sent on to the next place. Person who owned that house was called a station master, and they were responsible not just for the welfare of these fugitive slaves as they came through, but for trying to get them to their next stop. You see, very few of these slaves knew the whole picture. That was way too dangerous. They would know where the next stop was, and then that was all. When they got there, they would be conducted by a conductor to the next stop. But none of this was ever codified or written down. It simply would have implicated too many people. And after the passage of the Missouri Compromise and the fugitive slave law, anyone at all who aided and abetted a fugitive slave was liable for prosecution. And we know around here, people lost their farms, they lost their property, they were heavily fined. And some of the people in our black community who were monumental in assisting a lot of these fugitive slaves, they actually could then be arrested and sold into slavery, even though they'd been born free.
Now, when we talk about the Underground Railroad, we're talking about slaves and people helping them coming from southern states to the northern states. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, that divide and what caused that divide between the northern states who didn't believe that slavery was an appropriate thing to do to another human being versus people who really needed workers for their farms?
Yeah, and in many cases, I'd almost have to say, too, in the North, it wasn't always because of the most moralistic of reasons that people were against slavery. They just found that economically it was a liability. When they switched from crops like tobacco, which were labor-intensive, and rice, to grain products, they realized that their slaves were costing them money. So in areas closer to the north where you didn't have this large-scale plantation farming, you just saw people freeing their slaves because they had become a liability. Interestingly enough, here in Delaware, especially this area, and even down around Camden, Wyoming, and Dover, the fugitive slaves who came through weren't coming from the South. They were coming from the West. They were coming from Maryland, because slavery in Maryland was much more deeply entrenched than it was here in Delaware.
You mentioned the laws where, people would lose possessions and their status if they helped slaves. Yeah. But eventually there were laws, personal freedom laws, by some of the northern states that, guaranteed that once that slave made it to their state, they remained free. But that wasn't the case here, right?
Delaware was very odd. Delaware it had like a dual personality when it came to the institution of slavery. You had many very ardent abolitionists here, all over the state, most of whom were Methodists and Quakers. And they spoke out, sometimes very discreetly, but they spoke out against the institution of slavery. At the same time, you had very vocal agricultural interests who very much wanted to keep slavery on the books. And I think it's very ironic to know that in Delaware, a state that did not secede from the Union, that supported Lincoln, that joined the Union and didn't want to leave, also would not pass any laws getting rid of slavery until the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1901.
So they were the last state to do it?
Not the last, but among the last.
Among the last. The first state was among the last.
Yes, it was.
Interesting. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the Underground Railroad in Delaware when we return.
I'm Christopher Keene. I'm the owner of the Archibald Alexander House, and I love being part of the 302 and having my house part of it as well.
Welcome back. We're in historic Odessa talking about Freedom Seekers, an exhibit that chronicles the Underground Railroad in Delaware and in Odessa. And I'm joined by Johnny Baker. Once again, Johnny, now let's talk a little bit about this exhibit. When someone comes here, there's so much to see, but when they see this particular exhibit, what are they going to see?
Well, they're going to see an introduction to the institution of slavery here in Delaware and also in Maryland, because from here we're only about 15-20 minutes from the Maryland border, and many of our fugitive slaves came from there. So we'll talk about that, and we house most of the graphics that we have to explain slavery and the institution here in Delaware in an old outbuilding that was an old muskrat skinning shed. Now, years and years ago, believe it or not, muskrat was a very sought-after pelt. Not so much for its meat, but for its pelt. And you could get a lot of money for this in Europe. And muskrat skinning sheds dotted all up and down the Appoquinimink and other tidal rivers in Delaware. Many, many places, particularly residential places that had some kind of a business going, whether it was agricultural or in the case of us, it was a tannery. You would have a lot of these buildings dotted all over the property, and these were just perfect hiding places for fugitive slaves. They might have ducked into a smokehouse or into a muskrat skinning shed or into even a stable to hide during the day, and then at night, when it was safe, the conductor of that safe area would tell them where to go, whom to contact, and they'd be on their way.
That's amazing. And I read somewhere that it was easier for men to travel, for enslaved men to travel, than women and children. Is that true?
It is. And in many cases, it was because women had so much baggage with them. They would have children, they would have possessions that they had to take. If you were just a male field slave, you could take the opportunity whenever it arose and just go. If you were a woman who had children, you had to make sure you had food for them, you had to make sure you had warm blankets, because maybe your opportunity to escape came in the wintertime. You weren't going to just say, no, I'm going to wait till spring. You would go, but you had to take care of those children too.
I can imagine that must have just been,
It must have been heartbreaking.
horrific. Absolutely, absolutely. And when you talk about, some of these conductors or the guides on these journeys, a lot of them were either free before, or they were enslaved and then they were free, and they were basically risking everything to go onto these plantations to bring them to either destination, right?
Yes, and many of the abolitionists here in Odessa who were Methodists or Quakers, they were risking a lot. They were risking losing their property, they were risking imprisonment, but for free blacks, they were risking their freedom because they could then be sold into slavery.
And a lot of times, free blacks were actually captured and enslaved. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right.
Because documentation wasn't as strong as it is today.
No, and in fact, so much of what we know about the Underground Railroad is fragmentary. You get a little bit of information here, a little bit of information there. In order to do our exhibit, we had to research court records, documents, letters, and just pick tiny, sometimes tiny little clues and follow them, and eventually it tells a broader story.
I can imagine it must have been scary for the folks that, were trying to chronicle it in whatever way they could. You just mentioned that there weren't a lot of records, but there are some pictures or drawings of folks that were, working on the Underground Railroad or were a part of those using it to escape to freedom.
Sure, probably one of the best sources we have of information, even for here in Delaware, comes from a book that was published right after the Civil War, and it was written by a William Still. Now, he was the secretary of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, and whenever any fugitive slaves were sent to Philadelphia for processing and to be sent further north, whether it was to Canada or out to what we consider the upper Midwest now, he would not only help them, but he would chronicle their escape and write down that narrative. And he waited until after the Civil War, and after the Civil War was over, he then published the book. And that book is an incredible wealth of information, all of these escape stories and narratives. It's a fascinating, fascinating book.
I can imagine. It really gives you a look into, the heartache and what they left behind and what they were going to and what their life was about, even if it was just a very small summary. But now Odessa has a very prolific, famous story of its own about slavery and an encounter with someone on the Underground Railroad. And we're going to tell that story when we return.
Hi, I'm Laura Fravel. I'm the Sewell C. Biggs Curator of American Art at the Biggs Museum of American Art, and I enjoy art on the 302.
Welcome back. We're talking about the Underground Railroad, and I'm joined by Johnny Baker. Now, Johnny, you guys here in historic Odessa, you have a documented story of a woman's encounter. I bet she probably was super scared with a slave that was seeking his freedom. Tell us about it.
Well, we know that on a spring morning, probably I would think or surmise before the sun came up, a fugitive slave who had escaped from the Middletown area west of here came to the Corbett Sharp house, knocked on one of the two back doors, and requested asylum. Now, the only person at home was Daniel Corbett's wife, Mary. Daniel Corbett was kind of well known, but on the down low, even though that seems contradictory, as an abolitionist. And I think this fugitive slave, we later learned was named Sam, probably knew of him and knew that this was his house. He knocks on the door requesting sanctuary, not knowing that Daniel Corbett isn't there. He's in Middletown for business. So Mrs. Corbett has a real decision to make. She has a young daughter with her. She's pretty much alone in the house. Should she bring this man in and give him refuge? Risk probably her husband's reputation, hers, their property, possible arrest. But she decides to do the right thing. And she asks him to come in, takes him up some back stairs that were really only used by servants, and hides him in a small cubbyhole in a third-floor attic.
Now, when you say small, we're talking very
tiny.
small.
It's tiny. It's a place that's small enough that I think only sheer desperation would allow you to get in. And he was not known as a small man. So out of desperation, he's hidden there, and he's no more in that cubbyhole than there's a knock at the same back door. So she kind of collects herself, goes down, answers the door, and there's the sheriff, his posse, Sam's former owner, and they want to search the house. They say that Sam has been seen here. They also have bloodhounds with them.
Oh, wow.
So she's got to think fast on her feet, and she does. You've got to be pretty bold to knock on probably the wealthiest and most powerful woman in the community's door and say, I want to search your house. But she says to the sheriff, sure, come on in. I have nothing to hide, and there's no slave in here, no fugitive slave. She lets them in, but just as they're about to cross the threshold, she says, oh no, not those dogs, not those filthy dogs. They're not coming in my house. Very smart move, because they're intimidated enough already about her. So they agree to search the house. They leave the dogs outside. They search the whole house. They find nothing.
Wow.
They leave. She keeps Sam that night, gives him some food, gives him a quilt, gives him some money, and then under the cover of darkness, after her husband Daniel comes home, they take him to the King's Highway, which is basically Route 13 North, and show him the way north towards Philadelphia.
I can imagine that entire time her heart just must be beating. I mean, that's like something out of a movie.
Well, you know, it's strange. We know about this, and it's not just family lore, because in 1914, her little daughter, who was there, actually gives a speech to the colonial dames of America in Wilmington. And by this time, she's an older matron, and she's, I think, trying to kind of show them her bona fides as a real historical figure in this area. And she recounts this story as a family story. And as she does, in her speech, she says, my mother said she felt as if her heart was beating on the outside of her body. So yeah, there was real terror there. And imagine Sam, how frightened he was.
Absolutely, thinking that he's going to be captured. But, you know, that one decision not to let the dogs in the house, and you would think that that's a very normal thing for the lady of the house to say, of, you know, someone's hound dog, you know,
Sure.
no, not in my house. So it's stories like this that have given you, given Odessa a designation that's very special in connection with the Underground Railroad. Tell us about that.
Well, we are now a stop on the Harriet Tubman Byway, which is for us really a wonderful thing, despite the fact that we have no proof that Harriet Tubman came here to our site. We can pretty well surmise she was active in this area, especially since we have a Friends Meeting House just down the road. And then secondly, after 5 years of vetting by the National Park Service, we were named as a stop on the Network to Freedom, which is the Underground Railroad. And that connects us to all of the routes of the Underground Railroad from the west, from the deep south, and further on into Canada.
That's just an amazing story and an amazing designation. And when people come here, they can learn more about historic Odessa's rich, you know, connection to the Underground Railroad. So can you tell us, can we find you on Facebook? Can we find you online?
You can find us on all social media platforms. We have a really easy to navigate website. And there are sections on there about the Underground Railroad. And you can come here to see that as a standalone tour, or you can see it integrated into our fuller story of all of the houses that we show the public here on our site.
Something like 22 had different sites or houses, is that right?
Yes, here in Delaware.
So it's amazing. Thank you so much
Oh, you're
for
so
taking the
welcome.
time to talk to us about it. And we'll be right back. For more information on historic Odessa, you can visit historicodessa.org. That'll do it for this week's episode of the 302. We're going to leave you now with some beauty shots from the Harriet Tubman Park in Wilmington. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Tell them you saw it on the 302.